you, Stephen. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
Ordinary meeting, Thursday, the 19th of February, 2026, Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President, in the chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, the 12th of February, 2026, were read and signed. The following communication was then laid before the Society. The unfinished story of the Worcester College skullcap by Professor Dan Hicks, FSA. Thanks to return for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, February the 26th, 2026, and then adjourned the meeting. A reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Thank you. Ballots.
The following candidates for fellowship were elected today, Thursday, the 26th of February. I am reading the short version of the blue paper. The full version is available now for inspection on the Fellows platform. Sophie Ambler, reader in medieval history. Abby Antrobus, archaeologist specialising in medieval British towns. Rachel Ballantyne, Senior Research Associate at the University of Cambridge. Meg Bolton, researcher of medieval art and material culture. Sarah Charles, researcher of medieval pigment. Coleman Denny, historian of early modern Ireland and England. Bonnie Ephros, University of British Columbia in Vancouver. John Latham, historic buildings consultant. Martin Lightfoot, archaeologist with specialism in worked flint. Douglas Macmillan, organologist and researcher of musical instruments. Anthony Redman, conservation and building surveyor. Adrian Sassoon, researcher of porcelain, glass, gold, silver and lacquer. Carol Sweetenham, specialist in the history of the First Crusade. Sir Robert Rogers, the Lord of Lisvane, advocate for the heritage and fabric of historic buildings. Andrew Walker, researcher of local and regional identities. Barbara Wood, curator of cultural heritage and museum collections. Rosemary Yallop, architectural historian.
Thank you. We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear our lecture. Our lecturer this evening is our director, Sam Lucy Fellow, who is an archaeologist specialising in the late Roman and early medieval Britain, with particular focus on mortuary evidence. Her book, The Anglo-Saxon Way of Death, 2000, summarised Anglo-Saxon burial practice. And she has authored, edited a whole series of other site monographs. She was a lecturer at Durham for several years, then joined the Cambridge Archaeological Unit in 2002, where she worked on major publication projects, including prehistoric and Roman mucking, the chronology and synthesis of the Spong Hill cemetery, and several 7th century sites, including Westfield Ely, Trumpington. She is currently admissions tutor at Newnham College, Cambridge, serving also as the Director of Admissions to Cambridge Colleges. So we welcome Sam this evening to present her paper entitled The Bamburgh Bowl-Hole, a bioarchaeological and isotopic investigation of the Royal Anglian period cemetery. Sam, welcome, and thanks for the particularly tongue-twisting title. we may discover.
Thank you very much. You have to excuse me if I'm a bit croaky. I was teaching students on Friday and they sniffed and coughed their way through the whole supervision and they gave it to me. So I'm going to talk this evening about a project that it's been an amazing privilege to be a part of, which is the excavations at the Bamburgh Bowl-Hole cemetery. So this is something that I've been working on for quite a long time. We had an AHRC grant that we applied for, I think when I was still in Durham, possibly just slightly after I left. And that grant ran from 2006 to 2009. So this is a very, very long overdue piece of work. But just to kind of, I'm sure that this will chime with a lot of archaeologists. We all have our guilty projects that, you know, we really should have finished a long time ago. But if you do keep plugging away at them, sometimes they do actually get over the line. And this one finally has. So just to introduce the site to you, the site at Bamburgh is a known royal stronghold during the 7th and 8th centuries. I think it might be the site that is referred to most actually by Bede as being a historic site. And it's clearly a powerful centre. There are powerful people coming and going from it, activities there, you know, lots of sort of documented activity. The site itself is still an occupied castle. So those of you who know the northeast may well know this as a site. So it sits right on the shore, above Bamburgh Beach, very close to Lindisfarne, very close to the Farne Islands. And this is just a fascinating landscape. So there was a historical record, and in the 1960s, there were excavations by Brian Hope Taylor in the castle site itself that never got published. There were phases of excavations in the sort of 1959 to the early 60s, and then again in the 70s. And he did recover there through the excavations evidence of really quite elite activity. There was clearly bone working, metal working. This sword, for example, was recovered in one of his trial trenches, but the site was never published. And it wasn't until 1996 that the Bamburgh Research Project was founded. So this is a group of local professional archaeologists who were just really, really interested. And they've been going now for 30 years. They've just had their 30-year anniversary. They're still going strong. They still put on student training excavations each summer and are mainly focused on the excavations within and around the castle now. But one of the things that prompted them, I think, to do some of this work is that there was a historical record, an antiquarian record, that there were at least some bodies associated with this site. So in 1817, there was a storm, and the record of that seems to indicate that somewhere to the south east of the Porter's Lodge of the castle were remains of bodies that had been exposed by the storm. So there was clearly an episode of antiquarian activity looking at these bodies, probably destroying quite a lot of them. But it does end up marked on one of the early Ordnance Survey maps as the Old Danish Burial Ground. So there was always the hint that there was some associated cemetery to this site. So the Bamburgh Research Project in 1999 decided as one of their mini projects to see if they could identify where the Bowl-Hole cemetery was. So there was phases of trial trenching, and one of the trial trenches did indeed come up with evidence of human remains. And so over a series of excavation seasons, they opened up successive bits of the cemetery. So you can see on the plan here, the green areas are the excavated ones, and you can see the sort of hollow red outlines of the trial trenches. So there was a relatively comprehensive survey done, and we think that about a quarter of the extent of the original cemetery has been fully excavated over those periods of years. I was at Durham from about 96 to 2004, and colleagues there, including Charlotte Roberts and colleagues working in the isotopic world, we collaboratively put together a bid to the AHRC for funding, because one of the really unusual things about this cemetery, even though the bodies are in sand, and normally sand does terrible things to human bone, but because it's coastal sand, the bone preservation was actually really good for one of these cemeteries. And so there was a really good case to be made for a full analysis of a site that's clearly of strategic importance, real significance in sort of the early medieval period. So the AHRC granted us funding for a full osteological analysis, full isotopic analysis, which is very early on in the isotopic world. And I'm going to be talking a little bit later on about the isotopic results and how we've now reinterpreted them 10 years on. But also carbon-14 dating and historical and archaeological syntheses. So basically they gave us the funding to employ a postdoc, which was Sarah Groves, and to do all this recording and this analysis in conjunction with colleagues in the other departments in Durham. So huge thanks and acknowledgement to the AHRC for doing that. So by the end of the sort of final cemetery excavation season, there was 110 burials that could be worked with. So recorded in full with osteological analysis of the skeletons and then isotopic analysis subsequently. So as I say, the bone preservation is very good. So what I'm going to do is to take you through some of the features of the cemetery, the types of burial practice that we have there, and some of the interesting conditions that we found in the skeletons, and then to take you through some of the analytical stages to try and work out what it means that we have this collection of people. What can we tell about their lives? How do we relate them to the royal stronghold, for example? Obviously, this is a cemetery. I am going to be showing images of dry human remains. And this is a photo of Sarah, who was the postdoc and did an awful lot of the osteological recording for us. Okay, so in terms of the burial practice, the original antiquarian report seemed to imply that there were cist graves. There were sort of reports of stone slabs on their sides, which sounds like the Northern British Scottish cist burial tradition. And we do indeed have some documented examples of that. So you can see one here, for example, burial 6. You can just about make out the degraded sort of slate cist arrangement to that grave. That grave's then been directly cut through by another one, which is why the plan looks a little bit confusing. That cist burial also had this unusual deposit of red pebbles on top of it. So there were one of the interesting things about this site is, although it's a 7th and 8th century cemetery, it doesn't look like one of the southern ones. It doesn't have the normal range of artifactual grave goods that we would see in East Anglia, for example. So it does seem to be borrowing much more from the northern traditions of burial, so much more unfurnished burial, much greater use of stone structures, the sort of thing that we don't tend to get down in the south of Britain. So an interesting range of burial practices. We do have a few furnished burials, and the artifacts from those are characteristically 7th or 8th century in date. So this is just one example of that. Burial 3, which had an iron knife that you can see there, a single-sided composite bone comb, and then one of these sort of U-shaped iron keys. So relatively minimal furnishing, but enough to be secure in the dating of it. One of the intriguing things about this site, when we think about 7th and 8th century cemeteries, normally the mode of burial is supine extended burial with heads to the west. We don't have that here. This is a cemetery that uses lots and lots of different burial practices, and we're still not sure why. So So this would be one example. This is burial 27, so unfurnished, clearly prone, but also in a sort of slightly contorted, crouched position. And when we look at the distribution of the different burial practices, it's quite hard to see patterning within this. So, for example, the burials with grave goods are pretty much scattered across the cemetery. There isn't really a clustering that might indicate that it's the practice of a particular household grouping or a particular chronology, for example. This does seem to just run across all the areas of the cemetery that we have excavated. To give you a sense of the type of grave goods that we are looking at, this is pretty much all of our grave goods from all of these 110 burials. So as I say, it's pretty minimal in terms of the furnishing. Iron knives, as you can see here, iron buckles, and all of these would be pretty characteristically 7th century types. The combs, these two examples would be 7th or 8th century. There's some bone and antler pins, a couple of perforated shells, one glass bead. And that's pretty much the extent of the burial furnishing that we have here. So the furnished burial rite is in existence, but it's not the same as the one, as I said, that we get, for example, in areas like East Anglia. The original proposal was to radiocarbon date every burial, but when we were doing the research project, you had to request a certain number of radiocarbon dates, and they would only give us a few because they were being quite stingy at the time. So these are our radiocarbon dates. And as you can see here, some of the burials we were dating after the human remains had been redeposited into the St Aidan's Church crypt, which means that they were no longer accessible for direct radiocarbon dating. But we did radiocarbon date some of them while they were under analysis. And you can see the profile of that here. So those help to confirm that this is really a cemetery that's probably running from at least 600 to 800, possibly into the 9th century, but they would all quite comfortably fit into that 600 to 800 date range. There's clearly some residual animal bone that's been caught up in burial 94, which is why it's sitting off the front. That's probably not an earlier burial. There's nothing to distinguish that from any of the others. So coming on to the bodies themselves and what can be brought out from that osteological information. As I say, we had very, very good bone preservation, which meant that an enormous amount of information could be drawn out of these skeletons. So as I say, this work was done by Sarah Groves and supplemented by Charlotte Roberts, and it's Charlotte who's done all of the analysis of all of these skeletal conditions and writing about them. So we have, for example, a couple of skeletons, vertebral sections with evidence for dish, which is the condition that is often associated with being with having a rich diet, for example. There is a case of residual rickets in burial 12. And one of the sort of characteristics of the site was that the bone and the tooth preservation was so good, we could record things there that you often wouldn't pick up. So we've got kind of full recording, for example, of lots and lots of morphological differences, non-metric traits, metric traits. So lots and lots of kind of subtle differences that often don't get recorded or don't get reported in full. So there will be a publication of the data set as well as the volume itself. There are a couple of burials where there is clear evidence for weapon injury, which is obviously really interesting given the nature of the site that we are looking at. We've got two examples here, one of whom survived the weapon injury and one of whom clearly didn't. So the one on the left here, burial 20, this is a young adult, possibly male in skeletal terms, and the distribution of injuries across the skeleton is shown in the schematic plan. And if you have good eyesight, you can see that the top of the right shoulder has actually been sliced off. So that's a sort of a bone that's been sheared off, presumably by some kind of sword cut. There's also injuries to the ribs, the hips, and the right knee as well. So this looks like someone who's had a sword cut right the way down the right side, which is an intriguing example. There's also a healed weapon injury affecting the skull of burial 17, who is an older probable male, but that bone has started to regrow. So there is evidence there that that person had that injury but survived it. So what we have with this cemetery is an enormous amount of data. So we've got burial practice. We don't have many grave goods, but actually that doesn't matter too much because there's so much richness in terms of all of the other data that we've got. And one of the things that I tried to do when analysing the site was to make sense of it. So this is something that I've spent a lot of time trying to think how to do and to come up with different methods of doing it. Basically, by the time I get to this point, I have a very, very large spreadsheet with lots and lots of variables recorded, and trying to work out what sense to make of that is the challenge when you're writing up cemeteries. And so one of the things I tried with this site, and if you don't like spreadsheets, look away now, was to do something that was actually slightly mad, but I think was ultimately worthwhile. So you have lots and lots of variables, and I knew from looking at my very large spreadsheet that there was patterning in there, that things were correlated with other things. But it's always a challenge to work out the strength of that correlation and whether something is essentially negatively or positively correlated, and whether it's actually statistically significant or it could just be chance. So I went through an exercise of testing each of those relationships significantly. This is just a small subset of the ones where there was relationships. And if you're interested in this kind of thing, the sort of top half of the table is done on a test that can work quite happily with small numbers, and the bottom half of the table is done on chi-squared, which is only valid when you've got sort of certain sample sizes. So chi-squared is a little bit more robust. But I was also interested to see whether things were correlated with or correlated against, because that also matters in terms of the type of interpretation that you can put onto things. So essentially, this is my sort of trying to take a correspondence analysis, which archaeologists quite often do, and you get a nice picture showing that you've got clustering, but actually to work out the sort of the strength of those relationships and the nature of those relationships, and actually look at the underlying data to see what interesting things were going on. And there were some really interesting things going on, and I'll concentrate just on one of them because it's a fascinating thing that I still don't quite understand. So you can see my circle here, which is got the intriguing title of Squatting Facets and Tooth Notches. And just to explain what that is. So these are burials that have in their front teeth vertical notches, which is not a natural development. This is an acquired development. We had quite a few of these burials, and they were all adults. So this is something that those people were doing to their teeth over a lifetime that was causing them to have these vertical grooves in their teeth. If I go back, there's an incredibly strong statistical relationship with squatting facets, which are adaptations to the ankles that indicate that someone has spent a long time in the squatting position. And those two things you wouldn't expect to be correlated, but at this site they are. And my kind of supposition was that this is the result of some kind of probably craft or working practice, that they're adopting a squatting position and then they're using their teeth as tools to do something possibly textile related. Now, when you look at the nature of these skeletons, quite a lot of them are older females, but not all of them. They are relatively in sort of poor health. There's indications of poor health in some of them. And I'm seeing these as part of the working population associated with the castle site. I gave a version of this paper to some colleagues in Scandinavia a couple of months ago, and someone asked me whether these burials also had indications of lung disorders. And so I thought, oh, that's interesting. So this isn't in the book that we've published because I've thought about it since, but looking at the overlap between squatting facets, tooth notches or chips, and maxillary sinusitis, so the idea that people have had lung inflammation, there is a group of people where there's quite considerable overlap between these things. And my colleague in Scandinavia suggested that perhaps it's the textile fibres that are causing the lung inflammation if the teeth are being used to work textiles. So there's an intriguing condition here, an intriguing working practice. I don't know what it is. Hopefully someone can find out. But the data is clearly showing that that is something that these people are doing. So that's just one example of the kind of richness of the archaeological information that can be got out of these skeletons. I'm sure there's much, much more that can also be done. We were able to phase the site, so just into 3 phases, covering broadly mid-6th to early mid-7th, and then most of the 7th, and then most of the 8th century. And as you can see here, most of the cemetery is in use in all 3 phases. There's no clear sort of chronological development across space, except that in the extension area, which you see down in the bottom right, most of those are the later phases. So it may be that burial is extending away from the castle over time. The intervening bits here haven't been excavated. There are presumably still areas of cemetery in those areas too. So we think maybe there's a sort of gradual progression away from the castle. I've just indicated here a couple of examples of these interesting burials. Grave 20 with the massive weapon injuries is part of a linear row of later phase burials. That's a later 7th to 8th century burial. Burial 53 has these squatting facets and tooth notches, but is an older adult male buried in this tightly crouched position. So burial position was one of the other things that I was very interested in looking at. And as I say, normally cemeteries of this period are on their backs and laid out straight, usually with heads to the west. But that is absolutely not what we see here. So this is a plan of the flexed and the crouched burials. So quite a lot of the burials were on their sides with their knees drawn up to a greater or lesser extent. Quite a lot of burials were prone, so face down in the grave. And normally that would be an aberrant rite. You would only have 1 or 2 examples of that in a cemetery. People have written entire books about the meaning of this. But at this site, it seems to just be a normal burial practice. So they are choosing burial positions for reasons that I don't understand, but it seems to be part of the normal burial practice here. Even into the 8th century. So there's a particular row, which I've called the latest phase cluster, which has a very high proportion of prone burial, and that's probably 8th century in date. So again, I was trying to work out what all this means. Are these different groups of people? What patterning can we see? And we had the extra dimension of having the isotopic work done. So we have, for example, the dietary isotopes, and I spent many, many days generating different plots of different variables and trying to work out what it means. This is the nitrogen and the carbon isotopic results plotted and indicated what the burial position is. And this was one of the few patterns I could come up with, in that the prone burials were relatively tightly clustered in the center. So they seem to have the sort of, you know, the kind of not big variations in their diet. But that's about all I could do. There is something odd about the diet though, which is that when you plot the carbon and nitrogen results, which generally indicate the amounts of fish people are eating, the amounts of kind of freshwater or marine fish that people are consuming, and the types of diet that they're existing on, Bamburgh is a rogue site in terms of diet. So it's coming out where this blue star is compared to other 7th century cemeteries that people have analysed. My Westfield farm site, for example, is a relatively sort of enhanced nitrogen outlier, but Bamburgh really exceeds that and also sits much more negatively on the carbon as well. So there is a different diet here with variation, but as a whole, the population seems to be eating different things from people in the south of England in the same period. So that's intriguing. I don't understand it, but it's interesting. And we had all of the oxygen and strontium results as well. And this is where I'm going to go into a little bit more detail of how you start to interpret these results and some technicalities around that. The oxygen and the strontium is something that we had already published. So we produced a paper in 2013 which analysed oxygen and strontium in the ways that people were analysing these in 2013 and interpreting them. And our interpretation at that point was that over 50% of the people buried at Bamburgh were non-local, that they were from somewhere else. And this is where I go slightly technical, just to explain what's changed since then. It used to be that when you were interpreting oxygen in particular, you would identify a local proxy signal, usually by sampling local groundwater, and you would take that as your assumption for what the oxygen isotopes of the people at that site should be. So that's what happened in the 2013 paper. We sampled local groundwater, we identified a local range, and then anyone outside that range, we tried to work out where their oxygen signatures might have come from. So essentially, that's a proxy approach. And the result of that was that we found that there were some people whose oxygen was too cold to have come from the local area, and those were interpreted as Scandinavians, and a whole raft of people whose oxygen seemed to be too warm, and those were interpreted as people from either non-local UK or non-UK or Western Scotland and other areas like that. And so our 2013 paper is still cited a lot in terms of movement and people moving around a lot in the 7th century. So obviously with the new analysis, we wanted to have a look at that again, because there is another way in which people are now interpreting these kinds of isotope signatures. And that is instead to look at the nature of the sample itself, its statistical distribution, and whether there are any outliers to it. So rather than assuming you can identify a local signature and whether you've got difference, instead this says, do you have a normally distributed population within your isotopes? And if you don't, where are the outliers? So that's the approach that we've taken to this. So when we look at the strontium, for example, it looks like you have quite a clustered distribution of it, which maps perfectly onto the subadults, so the people who've presumably grown up in and around Bamburgh, but you have some outliers, particularly in the male population. Oxygen, not quite so clear-cut, but there is still quite a clustered distribution with perhaps some outliers. So we started to wonder if actually we had interpreted our original strontium and oxygen isotopic results in the wrong way, and that these actually weren't largely from somewhere else, and instead they were largely a population drawn from the local and regional area. The other thing that really made us stop and pause was that in the very early years of the project, a few samples had been sent to a different lab for analysis. And there were repeat samples, not from the same teeth, but from the same individuals done as part of the main project. And when we compared those, the graph on the left is strontium. So basically, if the readings were the same from the two labs, they'd be on the line. if they're different from the two labs, they would be off the line. Strontium pretty much matches. So we have almost identical strontium measures from both the Nottingham lab and from the Durham lab, but the oxygen is different, quite different, with quite a systematic offset. So this has now made me really, really worried about oxygen isotope analysis and how you interpret it. So we now have come to a position where we've identified far, far fewer outliers from our population than we did in 2013. So we are now seeing the bulk of the population as probably being local, but with a few people who do genuinely seem to be outliers. So people whose oxygen is too cold for the area, and they do sit off this in terms of statistical distribution. So it's a different interpretation now that we have of the site, but I think it makes much more sense, particularly now that we've got all of the osteological analysis and we can see this population as a working population. So these don't look like a large number of people who are elite. They clearly have signs of manual activity. We've got the craft workers. We have other people who have an interesting ear condition that suggests lots of exposure to either cold water or cold air. So people who've been kind of out working a lot. There is quite a lot of just sort of general wear and tear in their bodies, for example. So we now have a sort of a different picture of this site. And we're seeing this cemetery now as being the sort of the service population, I suppose, of the royal stronghold. And that probably makes much more historical and archaeological sense, actually, because there is always a chapel in the castle, and elite members of that household would probably have been buried in that location, as opposed to 200 metres away in the sand dunes, not marked in particular ways. So we do think that this is a service population with, you know, possibly a small number of people who seem to have come from somewhere else. So particularly Scandinavia. So basically, once you get above about 0.715 strontium, you're looking to more mountainous regions. And so we do have a clutch of people there, our strontium outliers, who do look like they are genuinely from somewhere else. So we end up with a very different view of this site. And just to take you through who the outliers now are. So these are the ones that sit outside of our distribution, whether on strontium or oxygen or both. And it's an intriguing bunch of people. So they're not being treated with kind of huge fanfare in these burial practices. And they run the range of all of these different burial practices that I've been talking about. So in terms of the strontium outliers, for example, we've got burial 8, who is an older probable woman. She has got grave goods, but she's prone and contorted in the grave. We've got burial 19, who is also prone in the grave, and a young adult male. Burial 30, who is tightly crouched but has grave goods. And burial 36, who is a young adult female, also prone. She's got the tooth notches, the squatting facets, and the maxillary sinusitis, so the kind of the lung inflammation. In terms of the oxygen outliers, you've got one burial 64, who is actually supine and extended. So one of our few burials that's kind of laid out in that way. But you've also got burial 37, who is probably male, older adult, crouched. He's possibly got dish, so that sort of high fat, high rich diet, but also tooth notches, squatting facets, and maxillary sinusitis. So probably one of this working population, and grave goods. So this is just fascinating. And I don't have easy answers for what this site means, but we have now at least published it. Thank you. So it's published as a BAR report with a kind of full burial catalogue and all of this analysis and much, much more detail on all of the skeletal conditions. But I think it just emphasises that when you're looking at these kinds of cemeteries, how important it is to start with the data itself, with the evidence. So rather than making assumptions about what burial practice does mean, instead starting with these kinds of correlations, with the identification of all the patterning that you can see, and then trying to figure out what that indicates about the population that you've got. So a lot of this was quite a big surprise to me when I was actually ploughing through the data and trying to work out what all this was. And there's still an enormous amount, I think, that could be done here with this in terms of thinking about that patterning, what it might represent. So we've kind of, done what we can at this stage. We have actually published it, which is a huge relief after 15 years of feeling pretty guilty about it. But a large number of people have been extremely helpful, and those acknowledgements are there on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. That was a fascinating sort of both the history of project and in-depth sort of analysis of the way that contemporary archaeology works. Can I press you to just take us a little further in how this fits in? Because I'm struck by the fact that these sorts of inhumation cemeteries of the middling sort or the working people aren't very common, and the extent to which you can link what you're getting here with other parts of the cemetery record.
Yeah, so it is really interesting. Normally, if we have a 7th century cemetery anywhere kind of down the east coast, south of Britain, you wouldn't have high proportions of grave furnishing, but what you would have is the use of some relatively high status grave furnishing. So it's the period when you start to get the gold and the silver necklaces, the work boxes. It's when bed burials date to. So it's a very particular rite that you see in the middle of the 7th century, often with high status female burial, but also some high status male burial as well. You get a few sites in particularly associated with the trading settlements that have a higher status male burial and some weapon burial. But it's not at all uncommon to have a site with high status female burial and not high status males in the rest of the country. So, but it does change as you go north. So as you go north, you are going much more up into the northern British tradition, which has less grave furnishing, but more elaboration of the grave itself. So cist burial, use of stone, cappings and coverings. So this is intriguing because it is almost like a merging of those two traditions. But the burial positioning is odd. So normally in our 7th century burials, most people would be on their backs, laid out. And that is really not the dominant right here. You do see quite a lot of crouched burial in the 7th century in Yorkshire. I did my PhD on the Anglo-Saxon cemeteries of Yorkshire, and that was one of the things that kind of surprised me at the time. So there is I think what you do get is regional burial rites that are the normality in that place. And that's, I think, what some of this is then drawing on as well.
If I could just follow up briefly, a fresh fish-dominated diet is extraordinarily unusual, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is, particularly as they're on the beach, which is not fresh fish, it's marine fish. So yes, I don't quite understand that dietary signal. And again, it's an area that could be more usefully explored than I was able to. I will say I'm not an isotopic scientist, but I am the person who wrote the isotope chapter with help from friends. But yeah, I think there is definitely more that could be done with that dietary material.
I open the questions.
Thanks very much, Sam. That was really fascinating. I wonder if we could maybe go forward in time, I'm interested in the sort of more current or recent local memory or knowledge. I think you mentioned, was it known as the Danish cemetery? Did people know it was there? Were there markers, that sort of thing?
No, so it was on the Ordnance Survey map. So when the project wanted to, so you have the antiquarian reference and you've got the map indication, but no, I don't think there was local memory. There was, I think there was a reference to a schoolgirl knowing something, but yeah, not really kind of embedded in local memory. But because there was the map location, that's where they focused the trial trenches, and that is actually where the cemetery was. So it was an accurate map location. But the intriguing thing about it is, in terms of what's happened to these bodies afterwards. So there was a very strong, this is a local project, and it's got the full support of the Armstrongs who own the castle. And there was a very strong feeling that these people should stay there. So the idea of reburying them in the sand dunes was explored. But actually what's happened is, in the village, St Aidan's Church had a heritage lottery fund to redevelop their crypt into a display place and a modern ossuary. So the bodies are in the ossuary. So they've kind of been reburied, but that's kind of where they're kept. But there was a very, very strong local feeling that they shouldn't be just sort of parked in a museum store somewhere. They should be kept as part of the community.
Thanks very much, Sam. I really enjoyed your talk, and it was particularly interesting for me because I have visited Bamburgh, a beautiful, beautiful part of the world, and recommend anyone visiting if they're up that way. I might have missed you talking about the positioning of the skeletons, the bodies. I might have missed you mentioning coffins, whether you thought that there were no indication of coffins. So examples of burials that I'm familiar with, the positioning suggests that those people were buried in shrouds or in a loose bag.
Yeah.
Because once they're put in the ground, you have no control over how body parts fall. And just to, and another point I wanted to bring up was your notches on the teeth. I've seen examples of that where people have been chewing or pulling grasses and reeds through the front of their teeth to make basketry. Yeah. And it's usually an older person's.
Yeah, those are the examples I'm looking for. So anyone who knows of that sort of tooth adaptation. But yeah, there doesn't seem to be indications of the shrouding that would characterize a medieval cemetery. So you don't have that sort of tightly arranged look. And the fact that so many of them are in, flexed positions and crouch positions, that doesn't indicate that there's shrouding. And there isn't really any evidence of wooden coffining, but there is use of slate slabs in some of the graves. I mean, it's clear from the antiquarian reference that there was quite a lot of damage done at the start of the 19th century with people hunting for them. And we do have some examples of graves that are empty and where the bodies, we assume, have been removed by antiquarian activity. But yeah, no evidence of wood coffins as such.
The mic's coming to you. Okay.
Thank you very much. Two questions, slightly related. The notches on the teeth, we're on the coast, mending fishing nets. If you're holding strands and it's like weaving baskets.
Okay, yeah,
could
be.
Just an idea.
Could be, yeah.
But the preservation of the bones and the different sand, is that the salt content? Like we would salt pork or whatever? I know it's bones and not flesh, but.
I think it's because it's not acidic. So it's the alkaline nature of it that means that it's preserved it.
We've got one online and one. Shall we take the online one and then?
We have a question online asking whether any DNA research has been done on the burials.
So we did one DNA trial to see if it did exist, which it does, but that's the extent of it. No further DNA evidence available.
As a lady, I assume with the bone that looks really waxy like that, it's really got a very high collagen content.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Yes, I was actually going to also ask about the DNA, whether there's been any DNA testing to see any familial relationships between the people. But the other question, I was reading about this a while ago, about the state of their teeth. And that had at some point been interpreted as sort of very high living, you know, potentially high sugar diets, gout, etc. But from what you're saying, and I think from what the recent research is saying, that those weren't the people who perhaps would have had such high living, really. I wondered if you could.
So there is, there's a very good kind of dental record for many of the skeletons, and there's relatively high rates of things like caries. So yeah, there probably is sugar in the diet, but it's not necessarily high living, if that makes sense. There's probably 2 or 3 people who do have indications of gout, but it's it's just part of 2 or 3 out of 110 or something. So in terms of the relationships, I spent quite a lot of time again looking at correlations between the metric and the non-metric traits, and there do appear to be groupings of people who have quite a lot about them in common. So again, there is a big data set there that could be looked at in terms of using that sort of data to identify potential family links and family groupings. But yeah, not a full suite of aDNA at the moment.
There are no more questions. We've got another one at the back.
Yes. We have one asking if you could please speak a little bit about the type of grave goods that were found in the site as a whole.
Yeah, so it's a very low-key assemblage. So if I go back to the slide that had, there we go, the grave goods on it. This is the grave goods. This is all of them, pretty much. So the knives are just quite simple iron. They would have had probably wood, maybe bone handles. The buckles would have been attached to a leather belt. Very little in the way of combs, just these 2 examples here. And then pins would probably have held little bits of clothing together. So I say it's very low key. I'm used to working on burial assemblages, and this is sort of really kind of insignificant in some of the assemblages that I would normally be working with. But consistent in terms of date, but again, probably just helps emphasize the point that this is probably a working population, that these are not the high status individuals who might have been given gold and garnet jewellery in the 7th century.
I'm not seeing any more.
There are more questions online if I can.
Give us a couple more online.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have one person asking about the diet, mainly if you could also analyse the local faunal baseline. They say, we analysed isotopically a site very close by, and the signal was much more in the line of Westfield Farm and other comparative sites.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, so I mean, there was analysis of the animal bone, which is in the report. But yeah, it's just the fact that the human population as a whole has such a strikingly different signal. I mean, it might be something like seaweed manuring or something that's affecting the crops that are being consumed, something like that. But again, it needs an isotopic scientist to have a think about that.
Another?
Yeah, go for it.
Yes. We have another question which says that You assume that high status individuals would have been buried in the ancient chapel within the castle, and they ask if there is any evidence of skeletons being found in that site.
Not yet, but I don't think they've excavated that bit yet. Yeah, I think it might still be a chapel. So yeah.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, and I don't want to truncate discussion, so, last call, no. Can we thank Sam very much indeed for a fascinating, in-depth understanding of this site. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I give notice the next meeting will be an out of London meeting held in the Glamorgan building at Cardiff University on Thursday, the 5th of March, when we will hear a paper exploring the early medieval frontier in the Middle Severn, preliminary results from the Marking March project by Dr. Andy Seaman, Fellow. Next London meeting will be held on Thursday, the 12th of March, when we will hear a paper celebrating 600 years of the Great Barn at Harmondsworth by Dr. Justine Bailey, Fellow. Meeting stands adjourned. There's a drink outside, please.